Hello, welcome back. My name is Dr. Christopher Gennari. This is Great Big History Podcast, and this is part 2 of our Death of Capitalism and the Great Depression. In this episode, we deal with the Great Depression. In our last episode, in part 1, we dealt with capitalism. What was capitalism? Why do people like capitalism? Why do people dislike capitalism? What is its advantages? What is its disadvantages? In this episode, we now talk about events. The events from of the late 20s into the 30s, into the Second World War. That starts in the late 30s in Asia and in Europe. So how does capitalism die? And this is a controversial statement because people will go, "Oh, well, I live in capitalism. I love capitalism. There's capitalism all over the place." No, it's not the same. It's just not the same. The world of capitalism you live in is just not the capitalism that existed in the 20s or the 1890s. Capitalism dies. Capitalism dies in 1929, and it essentially had a heart attack and died. And you can argue was revived in 2008. And we'll talk about that when we get there. So how did capitalism die? Well, like in 2008, that most of you have lived through. I hope all of you have lived through, because otherwise you'd be like 12. A series of credit implosions. Rich people, banks, companies were over-leveraged to invest. The New York Stock Exchange rose 400% from 1919 to 1929, which is fine as long as nothing bad happens. Now, you'll read, maybe even in our textbook, but you'll read online, oh, so many people were taking loans out and investing. Less than 10% of Americans had any money in the stock market. Even today, it's less than 50% of Americans have any money in the stock market. So you're talking about a very small group of people. But who had a lot of money in the stock market? Companies and banks. Rich people, companies, and banks. And that doesn't matter. It's fine. It's fine. As long as nothing bad happens. And in 1929, bad things start to happen. 1928, 1929, there's crop failures in the Midwest. And that kind of started it meant farmers who are always in debt. Farmers and ranchers are always owe money to banks because of the way simply the income is seasonal, but the costs are yearly. And you need a lot of startup capital to buy your seed, to buy your machines, to pay your workers. You need a lot of cash on hand to do all this stuff. But you only make money in big lump sums throughout the year. So farmers are always intimately tied up with banks. And if they were unable because of crop failures, and we'll get the Dust Bowl in Oklahoma, which just wipes out everything Oklahoma's doing. All those farmers in Oklahoma, they become the Okies who have to move to California and go from owning land and working their land to having to become sharecroppers at best and wage laborers at worst. You have these crop failures in the Midwest. That means farmers can't repay their loans. That means banks are already under stress. Then there's the London stock market crash because of investor fraud, because some of the biggest kind of venture capitalists or hedge fund, what we would call hedge fund guys today, turned out that they were committing fraud and got arrested. And so there was a London stock market crash, which means banks and companies that had invested in the London stock market kind of lost big chunks of money, which means they had to bolster up their losses in London somewhere else. Or they had to repay their own loans, which meant they had to sell stock in New York to repay the money they lost in London. The globalization of money from Midwestern United States to London City to back to New York was causing ripple effects throughout the economic world. And in October of 1929, you have the New York stock market crash, which is generally considered to be the start, the real start of the Great Depression. And you can see it. Look at our graph. Look how tall it gets. And then, whomp, how it crashes down. And there's a brief recovery, and it crashes again. And it just keeps going and going down. In the 28th and 29th of October, 25% of the value of the New York Stock Exchange was gone in 2 days. 50% of the stock market value was lost in 3 weeks. 90% in 4 years. I remember 2008. I remember 2007, 2008. I remember every day the stock market going down. And I remember being up so late that I listened to the opening of Tokyo, the Tokyo stock market, to see if that would go down. Because that opens in New York in the middle of the night. And it would open 500 points down, 1,000 points down. And 6 hours later, London would open, and that would open 500 points down, 1,000 points down. And then New York would open 1,000 points down. And every day it went on and it went on. Jim Cramer lost his mind on one episode. You could go and see Jim Cramer lose his mind on YouTube, needing a bailout, needing the government to step in to save capitalism. It's even worse in 1929. 90% of the value of the New York Stock Exchange was lost in 4 weeks. It did not recover to its high point of 1929 until 1954, nearly 30 years later. So we look at the stock market as this way of making wealth. It wasn't. For 30 years, it didn't. It was boring. It was a place to sell for companies to sell stock in order to get some capital, in order to improve and make investments. But a lot of them also went to banks or the government in the 40s and 50s, the 30s, the 40s, the 50s. The stock market was dead. 30 years it took to, almost 30 years it took to recover. 9,000 banks were wiped out. Not almost all, but most rural banks were also lost. Now you have to remember, why is that so bad? Because you look at these numbers, and I've had people who are not historians, right, say stuff, and they're like, well, it's only 25%, or it's the numbers belie demographics, the numbers belie geography. So okay, if New York City loses 100 banks, it's got 500 more banks. But Tuscaloosa might only have one bank. Now, that's probably wrong. Tuscaloosa is a fairly decent-sized town. But you might have rural towns which had one bank. You might have a county that in rural Iowa which had one or two banks. So if one of them goes out, that's 50%. And those banks that are going out, those were investments, which meant if your money was in it, you couldn't get it out. There was no protection. You lost your investment in the bank. This is why people start taking their money and stuffing it in jars, stuffing it underneath their mattresses. It was safer to not be invested in the economy than to be lost. That's the famous scene in It's a Wonderful Life where there's the bank run. They come to George and they're like, we want our money out. We want our money back. And he says, I don't have it. It's invested in all these houses. It's invested in businesses. Like, I literally don't have the money sitting here. It's been given to other people in the town. And they're like, I don't care. You owe me. I have $2,000 in your business. Give me the $2,000 and I'll close out. And so most rural banks are wiped out, which means farmers, ranchers, rural businesses have no ability, none, to borrow money, which means they're lost too. The U.S. gross domestic product dropped by $50 billion. It dropped by 50% of its value. America, in a year or in two, became half as wealthy as it was. That's the Great Depression. In 2008, as bad as 2008 was, as terrifying as 2008 was, the U.S. lost only 2% of its gross domestic product. The United States got poorer by 2%. In 1929 to 1932, the U.S. got poorer by 50%. So, okay. So how did a credit collapse equal the Great Depression? I mean, okay, so banks go out and businesses go out, and how does it work? Like, how does it spread? How does it become worse? And the answer was conservative economics and social philosophy. Now, to be fair, there wasn't really too much of an option to traditional conservative economics, but conservative economics do make it worse. So, the idea of rugged individualism, that real men feed themselves, that real men take care of their families, the idea that if you lose your job, you just go out and you get another job. You don't ask the government for help. That there just weren't the social services to help people in a crisis this big. The idea was, oh, just go get another job. And I saw this in 2007, 2008. I heard it from people. Lehman Brothers just went out of business. Just go get another job. You're an investment banker. Just do something else. Well, what? Be a real estate agent? Well, guess what just happened to real estate agents? Oh, no one's going to build any houses now because now the housing market is flooded with houses that people are trying to unload because they can't afford, or banks want to get rid of that they now have to assume because people can't pay their mortgages. So construction just died, literally died. I had students in 2004, 2005 who told me where I can put my education, where I could put my liberal arts degree. That they were in construction and they were making good money and they didn't need me for nothing, right? 2007, they were back in my classroom because the kids were the first ones fired. So this idea that there's always jobs out there and you're just lazy if you don't have a job, which meant there weren't the social services for men, for working men, for widowed children, for widowed women and children from the First World War. There were some. But that wasn't for men. And these weren't men wounded in war. So there's not the social services. Second is the collapse of the tax base. It means there's less money in taxes. So what the government then did, what Hoover then did, was stop spending money on services. The idea was government has to live within its means, just like regular people. And that is exactly what Republicans said, what conservatives said in 2008. We have to pull back what conservative states did. We have to spend less money. We have to cut back on services. Well, that meant there was less money for government to help people, literally employ less people. Thousands of teachers were fired. Thousands of government officials were fired in 2007, 2008. What does that mean? That means when government fires all those people, right? 10,000 teachers are going to lose their jobs in I don't know, South Carolina in 2007, 2000. That means they have no money. They don't have income to spend money. So that Walmart that you would buy your teacher supplies at, well, now they're not making that money either. So that Walmart is now going to close. Main Street, the restaurants in town, the first thing people cut back on. We saw this during the pandemic. We saw this in 2008. First thing people cut back on is expensive foods. So restaurants go out of business. Now those people don't have money, which means they can't spend money at the Walmart, at other restaurants. You see how this becomes a cycle. So the idea that men should just go get a job, that government's not responsible to help you make money, combined with the collapse of the tax base, combined to create this idea that government should spend less on services, which put more people out of work, which meant there was less money for people to spend, creates this cycle. And then add to it this idea that we should force Americans to buy American goods. The idea that if we just made people stop buying French wines, they'll buy American wines and employ American workers. So what they did was essentially end free trade and put high tariffs on foreign goods so that French wines now are super expensive. American wines are now cheap. That would work, except globalization meant that the American wine company was actually selling more of it, was making more profit selling in France than they were in America. And so what did the French do once the Americans put on high tariffs on French wine? The French do the same thing. The British do the same thing. And the French and the British do it not just with France and Britain, they do it throughout the British Empire. They do it throughout the French Empire. Which now meant your Indian tea, your Lipton tea was now expensive. And so people cut back. So international trade completely collapsed. By 1932, it is down 35%. It is a complete collapse of international trade. So there's no money in the economic system. There's no credit. There's no purchasing. There's no investments. Companies can't get money to pay their employees. Companies aren't making any money from selling goods, so they don't need to have the factory running. So they shut down the factory. They put more workers out of work. And essentially, capitalism died. It froze to death. Without the credit. See, this is the thing. On a day-to-day basis, most companies are in debt. Most companies don't have money. They go at the end of the year, they say, oh, we made a profit of $100 billion. But day-to-day, they don't have the money. They're constantly borrowing. That's what's called the commercial paper market. It's a market that unless you're into this, you wouldn't know it existed. But the same thing happened in 1929 as happened on September 16th, 2008. That's the other time capitalism died. Capitalism had a heart attack on September 16th, 2008. And that is where the commercial paper market broke the buck, where it was now you were going to lose money if you borrowed any money. If you gave out money, you would lose it. It broke the buck. That meant commercial paper froze. It meant corporations that just they borrow for 24 hours, 48 hours, right? Until Visa sends them a check for all the stuff that people bought on their Visa card, right? That happens every Friday. Well, on Wednesday, you've got to pay your own bills, so you go out and you borrow $50 million, right? Which is nothing for a large corporation. They couldn't do it. Capitalism had a heart attack. And that, September 16th, 2008, freaked out the Fed, freaked out government more than anything else. That was where this commercial credit collapse, the Lehman Brothers, the stock, the Goldman Sachs losing whatever, 90% of its value, where these companies were now out of business. AIG, right? On September 16, 2008, that's where it threatened to become the Great Depression, where it threatened to break all of capitalism. And how did they fix it? Well, we'll talk about that because they did the same thing that Roosevelt did, which is, let's be honest, throw a shit ton of money at it. And we'll talk about that in a moment. What became the symbol of the Great Depression? The unemployed man and the Hooverville. See, this is where rugged individualism failed, and Hoover's insistence on just get another job completely failed. There were no jobs. 25% unemployment in the United States. And you go, well, and I have had high school teachers, I've had teachers who are conservative on this, and it's like, oh, it hurts my head. They go, well, see, 25% means 75% of people still working. Yeah, but that doesn't include women. That doesn't include old people. Doesn't include children. That means there's a whole lot of people who don't have any income that you don't count. In fact, that 25% doesn't count farm workers or farmers who own their own farm. Farm workers declined by 80%. So it means the Midwest, done. It means agricultural communities in the South, wiped out. There are no jobs. Unemployment was 20% in the UK. It was 40% in Germany. This is a complete crisis of masculinity. We see this on our video, right? The guy's walking with a placard. I know 3 trades. I speak 3 languages. I fought for 3 years. I have 3 children and no work for 3 months. I only want 1 job. But there are no jobs. He's walking with this placard advertising, please hire me. But there is no place to be hired. But that was the idea of the rugged individual. You go out and you just find another job. But what the Great Depression did was implode. It killed capitalism. Capitalism died. So there were no other jobs. And that meant masculinity, which was based upon this, I will take care of my wife, I will take care of my children, I will earn an income or own a business, and my masculinity was tied to wealth, generating wealth, well, is now wiped out. So there's a crisis of masculinity. What's the purpose of a man if a man can't make money? If a man can't provide? Well, for African Americans in the United States, it's even worse. 50% of African Americans lost their job. 70% unemployment of African Americans in Atlanta. Black wealth was just wiped out. Black banks were destroyed. So again, that 25% doesn't represent black people. Because it does, but black people were 15% of the population. And so in that 25%, they come up as a blip. But for black people, there was 50%. In Atlanta, 70%. Imagine what Birmingham, Alabama was. So this homelessness, mass homelessness, entire towns of homeless, that's the Hoovervilles. That were the entire towns of thousands of people who were homeless, who just constructed these little shacks. The Hooverville was named the Hooverville because of the lack of help from the president. So it's an irony. It's an FU to Hoover. It's like, this is a town that was created because of you, because you're not doing anything. And Hoover made it worse. That's if you take a little look at the DC on fire, Hoover had MacArthur and Patton, 2 guys who we're going to talk about later during the Second World War, burn down the Hooverville in DC, which had 15,000 people in it, most of them World War I veterans who were camping out, hoping for an early payment on their promised World War I bonuses. See, to get men to join into the army in the First World War, the government gave bonuses. If you go and fight, we'll give you money. In 20 years, right? We're going to give you a good chunk of money, but we have to, you could borrow against it, but you can't, like, it'll be a lump sum, not when you get out of the army, but in 20 years. And people said, great. Well, it's now 1929. They've got another 10 years to wait. And they went to the government and said, Hoover, can we have our money now? And Hoover said, F off. No, it's a 20-year bond. You don't get it. Also, remember, he's spending less on social services, right? They're cutting back on spending. There's less taxes. So, if you're in a conservative economic mindset, you don't want to spend money. So you tell these people to F off. Well, they're like, no, we're going to stay until we force you through embarrassment to give us the money. Well, Hoover then had the army roll in and eject them. And MacArthur and Patton burned it down. There's our photos. Now, how much were those bonuses worth? In 2021 dollars, those bonuses were worth $58 billion. Think about how much spending that is. $58 billion. Think about how much credit would have been spent. Think about how many mortgages could have been spent, kept up with, food, consumer goods, clothes, paper, shoes, right? How many other companies could have benefited from the people getting that $58 billion and then spending it, which is what they would have done in the Depression. You couldn't save it anywhere. There was no banks. There's no investments. You can't put it in the stock market. So they were going to spend it. It was going to go right into their debts, into their living expenses. It would have went right back into the economy. But conservative economics, the rugged individual, said, no. So without men working, women went into low-paid service jobs. So women's employment goes up 25%. Now that sounds like a lot, but you have to understand, even by 1930, less than 30% of married women worked at all in any capacity, making any form of money. In fact, 25 states created work bans against married women by 1940 to keep women out of working, because the idea was those were jobs that men could do. You actually had protests, fire married women, right? Thousands of single women need jobs. If married, would we get jobs? You had protests by conservative women or young women who were like, no, get rid of these women. The men need the jobs. Black and Hispanic domestic servants, which was the number one job for Black and Hispanic women, wiped out, gone, because wealthy people didn't have any money. They had lost it all in the stock market. They had lost it all when the bank went out. So they can't keep their domestic servants. The idea that in To Kill a Mockingbird, Atticus Finch still has, is it Capernia? Still has a domestic servant, is a statement to just like how much money they have. And remember, they're poor. Scout, we're going to have this in a moment. Scout asks him, Atticus, are we poor? And Atticus says, yes, but we're not as poor as some other people. So the idea is that Atticus has kept Capernia working, employed, so that she can have some money, so that she could help her family. It's not a statement of Atticus's or the Finch's wealth. It's a statement of his willingness of community, of his connection to even the Black folk in his community, of trying to help them out with what little money he has. Now remember, Atticus Finch is one of the leading people in town. If he's poor, everybody in town is poor. Okay. So we are 20-something minutes in, and I'm going to stop here. I'm going to do a third video. I'm going to stop here. We're going to do a third video, and the third video is on Roosevelt, killing capitalism to save it. We're going to do popular culture, Superman, Batman, Scarlett O'Hara. We're going to talk about the politics, the economics, the invention of essentially liberal economics that we're still with today, that represents Bernie Sanders, that represents AOC, Representative Cortez, that is right now on trial in the Supreme Court with whether or not the government can forgive student loans. There's something that affects most of your lives is the idea of should you repay the bank that you borrowed money from. Now, that bank may be the government. It may literally be the Department of Education. But should you repay that debt? Or does the government have an interest in letting you not repay that $20,000, $30,000, $50,000, $100,000 and allowing you to take that $100,000 and do something else economically with it, whether invest it, whether buy a house with it, whether start a business with it, do something else. Where should that money go? That very debate is a conservative idea that you have a debt, you must pay that debt, versus the liberal idea that money moving through the economy is better than money tied up in future debt payments. So that's kind of what we're going to discuss. And the reason why it takes time is we are literally dealing with this every day. Just this past week was the Supreme Court case over whether or not the government can just wipe out student loans. And the liberals say yes on the court. Justice Sotomayor, Justice Kagan, yes. That will free up money for people to have better lives. That will free up money for the economy to increase because they'll be spending the money in the economy, whether through investments or purchasing. But the conservatives are, no. No, you shouldn't. You have a debt. You have to pay that off. And they have other arguments, whether it's fair to people who didn't get the payoff or what about other monies. But it's basically a conservative argument that, no, you have a debt. And you have to pay off that debt. So that difference starts in our next lecture. That idea, because for as much of a failure as Hoover is, and Hoover is a huge failure, there weren't really other choices. The British don't do anything different. The French don't do anything different. The Germans do something different. But they had a much more liberal, the Weimar Republic is more liberal, and they had a bigger communist party. So the only real alternative out there is communism. And nobody, none of the leadership on either side was on the liberal side or the conservative side was going to entertain full-on revolutionary communism, Russian, Soviet Union-style communism. So to give the devil its due, there were philosophical arguments. There were things Hoover could have done. But philosophically, he was a conservative. Philosophically, he was a traditionalist. So philosophically, there weren't other conservative ideas out there of what to do. So it was the traditional, just wait, it will eventually get better. But it wasn't going to get better because the entire system had collapsed. Capitalism had died in 1929, in 1930, in 1931, in 1930. Worldwide capitalism had died. So what's going to come after? And what's going to come after is this choice. Is it going to be a reformed capitalism? Is it going to be fascism? Or is it going to be communism? And that debate is going to go on until the 1990s and kill some 100 million people, maybe? It is the fight, that debate of what kind of economic system should replace laissez-faire capitalism is the debate of the 20th century. And to an extent, the debate since 2008 in the 21st century. So that's what we'll be doing next. So be safe, take care, and next will be part 3, Killing Capitalism in Order to Save It.